All right, guys. Love Your City podcast. Here we go.
Love so you change your city. Love stop you. Love your city.
There's something innately wrong about waste. And like many toxic environmental hazards, landfills are more often located near poor communities of color, creating yet another inequity that communities must unfairly overcome. So what do we do about it? Some might say recycle. Today we are diving deep into this now age-old environmental hero, the blue recycling bin. Is recycling the answer to our trash woes? And if it isn't, what are the solutions that cities everywhere can endorse? Thanks for joining us today. The Love Your City podcast takes real community challenges, contextualizes them and our current economic systems, and then introduces better solutions through the voices of those leading the way. One such voice is the voice of Jane Patton.
We literally have a hubris that does not allow us to recognize that real scalable solutions that work for the whole world could have come from a former colonial area. And if that's not nonsense, I didn't curse.
Jane is a fearless environmental leader who is working on the international stage to stop plastic pollution. She knows all the details about this garbage drama. But before we meet Jane, let's contextualize the issue. After all, we don't live in a vacuum. Our first guest is Jake Lipsman. He's the impact analyst from Life City. Jake holds a PhD in environmental sociology and has studied human and environmental development nationally. Jake, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Jake, tell us a little bit about you and what did you study and how did you get into this kind of environmental work?
I studied sociology at University of Kansas. I did my dissertation work looking at the politics around coastal restoration here in Louisiana.
Awesome. And I know we talk about the economy all the time at Life City and how, we want to build an economy that works for good. And we go to school, we study economics, and there are all these things that we just know aren't true. And yet our professors say, no, this is just the way the math works. But we're saying this is not the way the world works. So when we talk about trash and we talk about recycling, what about our current economy is leading to us generating a ton of waste?
Well, I think a big problem is that you have an economic system that's attempting to essentially grow infinitely inside of a biosphere that is not growing, right? And so naturally, logically, eventually you're going to come up against some limits, whether that's resource availability, whether that's our biosphere's ability to metabolize our throughput.
And so we kind of had, what part of the economy created the economic, like did we always live in this economy or is it kind of a recent thing?
Well, I think there's a variety of theories around that. I mean, the Great Acceleration, I think this happened since the 1970s, the advent of neoliberalism since, Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s has certainly led us on a pathway toward increased inequality and environmental degradation, and I think we're seeing a lot of that play out.
Yep, and in terms of the Industrial Revolution, what was it about like the ability to make so much stuff so quickly, so fast, that led to so much waste, do you think?
Well, I think before we really understood the metabolic limits of the biosphere, providing resources to everyone in as cheap and efficient of a way as possible, I think sounded pretty good. And this is something that we've been trying to do for, 250 years or something like that, and only within the last several decades have we started to see the problem. Of course, there are people and groups of people who have significantly benefited from the system, and despite, the fact that we understand some of the risks, hold a lot of power and are not interested in really allowing the system to change.
We have a coworker in Colombia, and we talk about how this ability to mass produce food and mass produce products isn't necessarily inherently a bad thing, that this allowed us to reach a lot of people really quickly. And you just mentioned a little bit about like that shift, like, okay, we learned how to produce, and now we've sort of figured that out. Where are we going to from here? We've kind of accomplished what this Industrial Revolution has set out to do. Like, talk a little bit about where we come from and then where we need to go.
Yeah, I think following World War II especially, there was a genuine need to create a lot of stuff to provide to a lot of people, right? And capitalism is really good at making stuff, right? So we spent the last however many decades really focusing on that, and I think what a lot of people are starting to realize at this point is that maybe we need to shift our focus from making stuff to distributing stuff. And the system that we have now is extremely good at making stuff. It's much less good at distributing stuff in a way that's equitable.
Yeah, we have this take, make, waste, this extractive economy that takes things from the earth, produces stuff, and then literally throws it away. Is recycling a solution for this waste challenge, or do we need some other systematic changes?
I think the problem with recycling is that it puts the onus on the consumer to resolve any ecological problems that we're facing across our whole society. You know, there's sort of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. I mean, I would say it's clear why recycling is the third one, right? It's like the one that we hope we don't have to get to. We'd be much better off simply making less stuff, or at least making less single-use stuff that we can reuse in its current form, as opposed to relying on recycling. You know, there's sort of the idea that recycling is the answer to our environmental problems kind of implicitly condones the idea that you can just make plastic infinitely because people can always just recycle it. And of course, we know from having watched the explosion of the plastic industry over the last several decades that that isn't really what happens.
So we went from being able to mass produce all of this stuff all over the world, which generated a ton of waste. And in response to that waste, and environmentalists and people saying this is a problem, we turned to recycling. And in reality, we all know now we're kind of waking up to this global crisis around recycling and our ability to actually do that. You know, we need to really dive into whether or not this recycling solution is actually real. And for that, we're going to turn to Jane from No Waste Louisiana. Broadly speaking, it's a myth that we can just, I'm not sure we totally hit that like the economy is designed to grow infinitely and a planet that can't. We have limits. Yeah.
So I think the economy as we know it now has actually always been fundamentally extractive and destructive. The economy that we have now is predicated on the extraction that is present in colonialism. It's predicated on the extraction that is manifested in enslavement, and going all the way back to the 1600s when we're looking at systems that were set up to enrich a very small amount of people in what we now would call the global north, but at the time was Europe, and Western Europe at that. And was subjugated the global majority of people. And it was using a system of exploitation, of extraction of both people and natural resources. That system has been in place for hundreds of years. The reason why we're seeing an explosion over the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution is because of the advent of basically electricity. And there's massive amounts of energy that have been brought into the system to be able to make all of the things that Jake was referring to and talking about. And that conversation about energy is so relevant because it has been used to essentially put this extractive system on steroids. And while we have seen the end of things like formalized systems of enslavement, we have not seen equity, as Jake mentioned. We have not seen an equitable redistribution of resources. We're still seeing a world system that is predicated on the myth of any kind of racial superiority or white supremacy. And that is underpinning a lot of the conversation that we're having here. So when we talk about plastics, and you ask me about plastics, the reason why plastics are related to the explosion of energy is because the explosion of energy came from the burning of fossil fuels. And plastics are made out of the byproduct of oil refinement. And it's out there producing because it makes so much money for the oil and gas companies, for the plastics companies, for their shareholders, at the just very clear expense of communities who live alongside these production facilities, who live alongside the sort of hot spots of where the waste ends up around the world, people who are forced to live and work their entire lives in mountains of trash so that Exxon's and Shell's shareholders can make money. I mean, that is unreal. And when we talk about how, oh, well, we can just recycle our way out of this, I am always struck by the fact that Plastics have been in the consumer marketplace for 50, 60 years at least. And so far, from all the plastics we have produced since the 1950s, we have recycled 9% and that's a generous estimate, of all the plastics that have ever been made. We are right now growing plastic production at an alarming clip. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that have been invested in new plastic production on top of the production that has already been skyrocketing in the last 20 years. We're throwing pennies at recycling development. And you cannot look at this system and see massive growth in production of something that's already a problem and look at teeny tiny growth in the solution, I'm using air quotes, to that problem, because those two things don't match up and they are never going to be reality. And if you look behind who is pushing recycling for plastics, it's the plastics industry. And if recycled material were ever going to actually offset virgin plastic material, why would the plastics industry be pushing for it? And the answer is they wouldn't, which means that also inherently tells us that recycling is never actually going to offset virgin plastic, at least not in the vision of the plastics industry.
Why don't we tell us a little bit about tell us about your story.
Sure.
Who are you, and how did this passion of yours emerge?
Sure. It's a little warm, so I'm going to stay hydrated. I am Jane. I grew up actually just a little bit down the road from here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I got into plastics while I was in grad school. I actually went to grad school to become a good little neoliberal. Jake mentioned that earlier. And I had a whole career working in a very neoliberal field. And just so that I'm clear, when I think of neoliberal, what I think of is the privatization of the public commons. I think of the intent to make money off of something that should be a social service. And I worked in charter schools for a long time. So if there's no other example of that, it's charter schools. And so I was doing that I interned for a plastics organization when I was in grad school, and then took a few years to go off and have a whole other career that allowed me to come home to Louisiana, which is nice. And then when I really started to peel back the curtain on charter schools and realize that it really wasn't the place for me, and I wanted to be working in something that was a little bit more systemic and just closer to my community, I left that to go work for full-time for a plastics organization. And that was sort of how I got into this field. And it's really easy to be like, well, plastics, how is that close to your community? But because Louisiana is actually one of the top plastics producing states in the United States and locations in the world, it's very close to this community. And also, I live in New Orleans. I love this city very much. But its efficient waste management leaves a little bit to be desired. So, so it's sort of in your face all the time, the issue around resource management and mismanagement of plastic waste. It's in your face, it's in your street, it's in your garbage can. And so that's really how I sort of got into this space. And it's a very long, it's 10 years and a very short story. So, but the organization I'm privileged enough to work for is based out of DC and Geneva. So the work that I get to do with them is both local and international. So a good chunk of my work actually is I co-manage a global coalition of civil society organizations that is weighing in on a new plastics treaty. We're going to be negotiating a new environmental treaty at the United Nations, and I help herd the cats that do that work. So it's great.
That's awesome. And why is it so important to have, we know that at least in New Orleans, like when we started this work here in Louisiana, you could start recycling as a business and actually save money because trash was more expensive and we could resell these products. Mm-hmm. So speaking of, resource use and, if you can keep the resource in the economy and out of the landfill, that's a good thing. It's creating jobs. It's keeping the material alive. Now it's more expensive to recycle, and in some cases, no one's actually doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's related to a lot of the international networks and markets. Talk a little bit about, why it's so important to work at the international level around a lot of these, I'm sure a lot of these systematic problems, but in particular for recycling.
Mm-hmm. So there's two really clear reasons. One of which is plastics are a global supply chain. And if you have a global supply chain, you need to have a global solution. And what I mean by a global supply chain is that I mentioned that here in Louisiana, we produce plastics. We're not the only place in the world that produces plastics. There are a couple dozen countries that actually like take the byproduct of the oil refining or the natural gas liquids and make polymers out of them. But there's also 200-ish countries in the world. So you're still talking about a small portion of countries that are plastics producers. And yet we are all plastics users, all of us. Basically, almost every person on the planet, with very, very, very narrow exceptions, are interacting with or using plastics in some capacity every single day, whether you want to or not. And that means that it's not a choice. It's not a consumer choice. Sometimes it's not even a small business choice. It is a global supply chain choice. Sometimes it's not even a government choice. We talk to governments all over the world that say we really want to manage our plastics, we really want to limit plastic waste, but we actually have no way to stop imports because we need to be able to import food to feed our population, and that food only comes in plastic packaging. The entire global logistics supply chain is dependent on single-use plastic film in ways that consumers never see. And so this problem of plastics is absolutely a global one, and because of that, it really warrants a global solution that is very all hands on deck, that is very well negotiated, and that is very, as we say in the global policy system, fit for purpose, in that we need to have a solution that is actually focused on the objective of reducing pollution from plastics.
And why are countries that used to take our plastic no longer taking them?
Because there's just too dang much of it. I believe what you're referencing, Liz, is that until 2018, China as a country was actually importing most of the world's plastics that were labeled for recycling. So they're not importing our landfill trash. They're importing the things that we baled and said were recycled and shipped overseas. And in 2018, China basically said, well, our domestic markets have actually reached a critical mass so that they get enough plastic to feed their recycling infrastructure domestically in China. And that the plastics that they were importing were frequently not cleanly baled. Like they had mixed plastics in the bales, or the plastics were literally dirty. And it just was not cost efficient for them to import plastics from other countries. And so when China shut off the importation in 2018, which was, you've heard it referred to as the Green Wall or the National Sword policy from China, a number of other countries in the Southeast Asian region tried to sort of pick up the market slack where China had left it. Some of those countries were immediately like, whoa, this is too much, and shut off importations themselves and refused to import recycling. And some of them doubled down and are importing more and more recycling to try to corner that recycled materials market. But the minute we talk about a recycled materials market for plastics, we are immediately hit with a barrier. And that barrier is that plastic is not designed to be recycled. It is designed to maximize single use, to maximize efficiency in single use. And when you have a material that is overrunning the global economy, that is not designed to be recycled, and you have countries and companies, because these are not publicly owned waste management companies, these are privately owned waste management companies that happen to be in different countries. When you have these companies that are rushing to take in all this plastic, they are realizing that they are already fighting an uphill battle. What I would say is a Sisyphusian task of pushing a boulder up a hill that it was never designed to go up, and that they don't have enough resources and enough strength to actually push up the hill. And you combine that with the fact that the minute you recycle plastic, the first time, it degrades materially. It is a less quality material the minute you run it through a recycling system, which means in order for recycled plastic to be in any way useful and to retain its original qualities that make it such a demanded material, you're having to constantly add new, clean, virgin, what they call virgin, which is a horrible term, and I'm sorry I just said it like 3 times, but you're having to add new, freshly made plastic resin to mix with the recycled resin to make a product that is in any way useful or sellable to the true consumers of the plastics industry, who are not you and me. The consumers of the plastics industry are consumer goods companies. They're Nestle and Coca-Cola and Unilever. It's not you and me. They're the ones buying the plastic. I'm just buying the deodorant. Know what I'm saying?
I think what you just said is a big part of it. The average consumer might not critically imagine what that process looks like. Might think that recycling can happen indefinitely or infinitely, or can happen in a loop that just kind of goes on, when in fact maybe you're extending the life cycle of some part of that material for a short amount of time, but you're really only delaying inevitably that becoming waste.
Right. I mean, the vast majority of plastics, of any material that you put in your recycling bin, there is no material whose recycling rate is greater than 50%. And plastics recycle rate is closer to 4 or 5% is the most recent data. So the vast majority of materials you put in your consumer recycle bin are not going to be recycled. And even the ones that are, there are some materials that can be recycled infinitely. Paper, cardboard, aluminum can theoretically be recycled infinitely. But even the recycling rate for aluminum is only 45%. I mean, you're still not looking at you're not looking at a 1-to-1 recycling rate, and you're not looking at a system that is actually truly predicated on design for recycling. I even feel less bad about using an aluminum can than a plastic bottle, which is it's based on that 45%, which is higher than 5%. But the aluminum cans are lined with a plastic wax on the inside, which means every aluminum can also has that plastic wax on the inside, and it also has ink on the outside, which means there are elements of that aluminum can that can't be recycled and that have to be cleaned out. That is an energy intensive process. And so even relying on recycling for things like aluminum is really energy intensive. Even for glass, right? Most glasses have labels. They have something printed on the glass. This is not, they have plastic caps or metal caps. This is not a perfect process. Anything that we imagine that we take as consumers from a store and consume whatever's inside of it, whether it's a Coke or a beer or laundry detergent, and then we put that product in a waste stream that we think is for recycling, there are so many inefficiencies present throughout that entire line that what actually makes more sense for planetary survival and resource conservation and the circular economy is for us to eliminate that entire linear progression and actually base our distribution of Coca-Cola or beer. Clearly, you know what I like.
We're
or
in
cheese.
New Orleans. I mean,
yeah, we are in New Orleans. Laundry detergent. That we actually distribute that in reusable containers. And just like you have curbside trash pickup, if we actually had institutionalized systems of reuse, we could have curbside reuse pickup. And so these are the things that we need to be thinking about that are really systemically different. And I know that people are like, oh, that's so huge. How could you possibly propose that as a system? And I sort of look around and I'm like, I don't know. We made our current system, which is pretty big and also inefficient. Like, I feel like we could make something better maybe.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of public money that goes toward this system that is terribly inefficient. And there's no reason why we can't redirect that public money to do things like incentivize reuse or help cities transition. You know, we're in a coffee shop, right? You could have coffee shops on a network where they're all using the same standardized reusable cups that you carry out. They get collected, cleaned, redistributed to the city's coffee shops, right? There are models that are working like that all over Africa, all over Latin America. They're working in New York City. They can work anywhere. We just have to actually invest in them, and we have to have a system that values that. And right now we don't, which Jake outlined earlier.
Yeah, I think one of the most frustrating examples are like the paper cups that are from, like Starbucks or something, where it's like you assume, well, it's paper, that's better than plastic. But of course, think about it, a paper cup would just get soggy if it didn't have the plastic liner on the inside, right? And so you don't think about that, you assume, well, this is paper, it's better than plastic, but
paper is also made from trees, which are an increasingly scarce resource and themselves a carbon sink, right? In the work that we've been doing on plastics for a long time, there was a group that was Stand.Earth that was working on I think it was like replace the cup. They were working on Starbucks to replace the paper cups with plastic ones because they were trying to save trees. And we had to partner with them to be like, maybe reusables would be great. And so this is really where we're we're getting into this space of, you know, how do we protect our communities and how do we make sure that people are not harmed? So when y'all were talking about the circular economy a few minutes ago, there's 2 core pillars of circular economy. And one of those is resource efficiency maximization. Make sure you are minimizing waste and maximizing your available resources. And the second pillar is eliminating externalities. An externality is a cost or a harm that is borne by some other entity, and usually the public, rather than the actual person who caused that harm. We've been talking about the first pillar, and we've barely started talking about the second one, which is externalities, which is really being concerned about the fact that plastics are toxic. They are a toxic material from the minute they are made. The production of all plastics, I'm so sorry, y'all, all plastics, releases into the air, into the communities that live around these production facilities. They release carcinogenic chemicals. Every plastics producer in the state of Louisiana has been granted a permit by the state to release down to the decimal point known human carcinogens. Every single one of those facilities. And there are people who live alongside those facilities. Now in Louisiana, those people are almost exclusively black and brown. They're all poor. We also see that a chemical alley developing in Appalachia. Appalachia is mostly white. There are dimensions of this problem that are very racist. There are dimensions of this problem that are inherently classist. And what we are seeing, and that's just in the United States. I don't know the demographics of every community alongside every plastics producer in the world, but I imagine it's very classist at the very least. So what we are seeing is a system that is requiring the unknowing, unwilling sacrifice of health and quality of life from entire communities. We're talking about children, grandparents, and in the case of Louisiana, we're talking about people who are descended from people who were just to their core extracted from, because in Louisiana, these chemical plants are built on the same property that the cotton plantations and sugar plantations were built on. So we're talking about the descendants of people who were formerly enslaved. We are talking about a system that is perpetuating harm and has been for hundreds of years in ways that when those communities fight back and say, this facility that produces neoprene, for instance, in St. John Parish, that it's dumping dioxin and benzene into the atmosphere and it's hurting people, the state agencies will actually come down and tell those people that they are fear-mongering. You have to stop fear-mongering about what is being dumped into the air, even though those agencies know that they issued a permit to that facility to allow for those carcinogens to be in the air. This is what we're up against. We're gaslit all the time. We're told that our lived experience is not our lived experience. And I'm saying we, because I think all people in South Louisiana are affected by this. But I am also very clear about the fact that I live in New Orleans. I have privilege that is afforded to me in my previous generations who lived in New Orleans that is not afforded to a lot of the people who are actually told to their face that they are fear-mongering. And, even as folks classify us as like activists, I'm saying with air quotes, and environmentalists, I'm saying with air quotes, I don't think the moms who walk out of their doors in the morning and don't want to feel acid rain on their skin and don't want to smell the sickly sweet smell that comes off these chemical facilities and don't want to have to be bringing their babies to the doctor's office every other month because of asthma or skin irritation or some problem. Those mamas are not environmentalists, but they're damn sure going to organize against those chemical plants. And that's what we have to be thinking about. And that's only on the production side, right? Because we're also talking about the impacts of plastics downstream. If you're taking those plastics and chemically recycling them, for instance, you're applying huge amounts of heat to them, that's going to release emissions. There are people who live next to those facilities. There are people who work in those facilities. A lot of those people are not unionized because a lot of unions have been broken up. And a lot of other countries don't even have unions. So we're looking at just this systemic chain of people who are expected to sacrifice at the altar of progress, which is what plastics have come to symbolize.
So
yeah, I was gonna say on the consumption side, like you mentioned earlier, countries in the global South importing recycled goods. You've got a clear example of unequal ecological exchange where people who aren't benefiting from the products at all are still the ones bearing the environmental brunt of it, right, on the consumption side. So there's a global environmental justice piece to this.
And yet there are some folks who are living and working alongside the places where this waste is being imported and being brought in, who genuinely derive a livelihood off of these plastics being brought in. And when you have conversations with them about changing this system, there is very naturally a fear of changing this system because they know that they actually do make money off of it, and plastics are the thing that they're making the most money off of. So there are many things that we have to look at in this, and this is where you get into this conversation about a just transition. And when you're really talking about circular economy, and you're really talking about building an economy that is within the planet's limits, that is eliminating externalities, you have to make sure that every worker and every person has an equal or better job and quality of life. Because if you are creating a circular economy where you still have requisite poverty and requisite harmful outcomes, that's not a circular economy. Who does that work for? It certainly doesn't work for everyone. And I don't think you can claim a circular economy if you're churning toxics through it and if you're requiring undignified, harmful, toxic work and life and not guaranteeing dignified, well-paid, safe work and life on the other side.
And I think thank you so much for just explaining that so clearly. And I think that most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to contribute to this really gross, inequitable, unhealthy process.
I mean, I hope not.
And I think most people want to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And so we have this complex situation, but you said it right, the unknowing, the unwilling. You have people who don't even know that they have to be facing these environmental issues. Mm-hmm. You have people who don't even know that they're contributing to these environmental issues. And it's all in this large system. At the same time, we go to a hospital and we're very grateful that plastic is there to save our lives. Mm-hmm. And so the just transition, how do we then transition to something better? And so you started talking about some solutions. So in cities everywhere, they're exploring opportunities for reuse. Mm-hmm. So building up infrastructure for reuse. What about on the material side? Are there opportunities to replace plastic with an alternative material mm-hmm. in a hospital so that we can still have the benefits of the tubes and all the things that we need to survive in certain situations? And certainly, we all use plastic a lot every day. What are some of the material solutions in addition to some of the infrastructure solutions that we've already discussed?
Mm-hmm. I love that question because plastics so far have been, you could say, quote unquote, the best material we have thus far for some of these medical applications. That doesn't mean it's the only functional material. There are other materials that are already in the market. I'm not a material scientist, so I'm not going to go into depth about different kinds of products, but there are materials like silicone. There are materials that are truly inert. Whatever material we adopt, and we should be aggressively looking for a non-toxic, truly biodegradable, designed for recyclability, actually collected for recycling. We should be actively looking for that. The government should be investing in R&D to develop that material. The government invested in the R&D that developed plastics. During World War II, when we were short on wood and metal for the war effort, literally the government invested in the scientific labs that developed the plastics, and then they allowed private industry to patent it. So that's what we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at a massive public works program that is doing things like employing people to be dishwashers, really deploying and going around and installing dishwasher infrastructure at every food place that doesn't have it right now. We need to have we need to raise the minimum wage and guarantee collective bargaining for all workers. And if you think that's not part of this issue, part of the reason why people get stuck and part of the reason why people are willing to take jobs in this system is because we all need to feed our babies, and the only way to feed ourselves and feed our babies is to take jobs. And some of those jobs require you to give up dignity, and that should never happen. And so we have to be looking at how we are protecting collective bargaining and unionizing, how we are making sure that people are being paid livable wages. Livable wages allow people to take pride in their work, and that's important. We also need to be looking at shifting the public subsidies from the oil, gas, and petrochemical industries toward research and development to genuinely make sure that we are living within our planetary and national resource boundaries, to make sure that we are generating a material that could actually work in other places, and to make sure that that material is truly non-toxic and not extractive throughout its supply chain. And I would say the other thing we really need to do is we have to get out of this idea of U.S. supremacy. We have to get out of this idea, this false idea of European supremacy. And we have to recognize that there are material scientists who are actually using indigenous and traditional knowledge in other places, in other countries, that have already come up with materials that are just as functional, but actually less harmful and toxic than plastics. And we in the global north actually don't give them the time of day because we literally have a hubris that does not allow us to recognize that real scalable solutions that work for the whole world could have come from a former colonial area. And if that's not nonsense, I didn't curse. But like, that's the mentality that we have to get out of. And we have to be urgently working toward that and being honest with ourselves about that.
See, this is why I sometimes wish aliens would come. Because if we could have a global war effort that would unite us as a planet.
Oh, no. No, give
might
peace
be able
a chance.
But maybe we don't need aliens, but maybe we need climate change to be the fight. And if we can all recognize that we have a global issue that we all need to come around the table for, then maybe we can do all the innovation that we've done in the past during previous war efforts. It's kind of sad that humans can do so much. We can build orchestras, and yet we innovate during a war. A war, like. What about living? What about innovating for like just some peace of mind and some joy? Like, that's what we're here for.
I don't know, Liz. How are you going to make money off joy?
Well, that's the thing is we don't actually want, joy doesn't bring money.
No.
I mean, joy doesn't come from money.
Happy people don't shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so wow, we wake up every day just blindfolded by the idea that we need to go buy things to be happy, blindfolded by the idea that we're doing good when we recycle something, blindfolded by the idea that all of the things that exist have been fairly, brought to be through some kind of natural innovation, idea exchange, when in reality it's really government controlled, government incentivized. There is no free market. And so how do we lift up that veil and actually build something better to live the lives we really want to live? And so you've talked about reuse systems, so building up new systems. But I think you're right. Like, part of this is just the ideological idea that, like, we can do it, that we don't have to. That's step one, is realizing, like, this system doesn't have to be like this one. We can build a different one, and we can transition to that. Zero Waste Challenge is happening on July 12th. We're going to try to get hotels and restaurants and the whole city of New Orleans to reduce their waste. You mentioned it earlier. Like, we are surrounded by trash in this city. It's on the ground. It's everywhere, and yet we're also surrounded by petrochemical plants that are creating the trash. So we're at ground zero for this issue. How do you think a hotel can look at this? I mean, you talked about buying dishwashers, you talked about wages, you talked about, if you're a hotel working in this existing system, or a restaurant, what advice might you give?
I think very materially, I would ask for restaurants and hotels to set an actual goal. So not just to say like, oh, I want to be more sustainable or I want to go plastic free, but to set a real specific goal. Like, I want to reduce the number of bags I'm taking out to the garbage every day, or I want to maximize my material that's going for recycling versus my material that's going to the landfill. So that's the first advice. The second advice I would give is know your system. Know where you are. You are in the city of New Orleans, and in the city of New Orleans, we sometimes recycle plastics 1 and 2. If you're lucky enough to get your stuff picked up. Sometimes. And we mostly recycle cardboard and aluminum, and sometimes we do well with hazardous waste, right? But so you need to actually know your market and understand what is the waste system that you are putting things into. And as much as possible, not only do you need to set goals for transferring more to recycling than landfill, you also need to set goals for bringing down both of those footprints, and really looking at how can you implement more systems of reuse. You know, we're in this coffee shop. We're almost all using glass mugs and cups. That is an option that you have to ask for, right? They don't just give it to you automatically. Why not? Like, we could give it to people automatically. Or you could just not have single-use options, which I know is so scary because to-go coffee is like chic. But I think that's really what we have to focus on, is how are we, you know, literally eliminating single use as much as possible. And at hotels, we've seen, you know, systems for hotels that have shampoo and conditioner dispensers on the wall instead of little individual plastic things.
And for hotels, like, sorry, Jane, you know, I have to work real fast. I got 50 people coming for this event. I have to do this quickly. Why should that person care? Why should that person go the extra mile to say, this is hard, this is a change of culture, I should still do it because why?
Because you have so much power, honey. And that power is very exciting. You have power over all 50 of those people that are coming through your hotel. You have power as an economic engine and driver in your local community. You have power to influence policy. You have power to materially make someone else's life better. Why would you ever pass that by? Like, that is the thing I wake up for in the morning, is how do I make my people's, my communities, my friends, the strangers around me, how do I make their lives better? And maybe I'm just a crazy person, I don't know, but I think most of us actually want to make other people's lives better, and that's genuinely what we want to wake up for in the morning. And so I think it's important to reinforce that people who work at restaurants, who work in hotels, just have an incredible power and incredible opportunity to educate people, to make a measurable difference on the world, and to really use that power for good. And in the city of New Orleans, like 35% of our budget comes from tourism. They're going to listen to you. You go to the city and you say, we want to change this policy. You go next door to all your hotels that are in the CBD, or all your friends that are also hotel concierges. And you all, is that the plural concierge? I have no idea. And you all say, you know what? We want to do something different. We want the city to incentivize us switching over to dispensers for shampoo and conditioner instead of single use. And city, we want you to help us with that. We want you to give us a credit, or to give us a label, or to do something that incentivizes us to do that. And that way you're not doing it by yourself, because that's like the number one risk that hotels and restaurateurs are facing, is they're like, if I go out of my way, it is right now in the current system, unfortunately, more expensive in most cases to go zero waste. And if you as a business go out of your way to take on that extra expense, you need to make sure that you're going to be able to maintain your bottom line. I don't like that, because I don't think that's how the economy should work, but that's how it works. And so we have to really work with hotels to incentivize them to not be alone, because it's being alone that amplifies the risk. And that's why I think stuff like Life City and the programs that Life City puts together, and the support that you get from the city of New Orleans and the big businesses around the city, is so important, because companies have to be able to see that they're not alone in taking on this.
And if we work together, we can hopefully bring that price point down, because the scale will
totally
create that demand. So I think, you know, there's hope for the city of New Orleans. We might be starting at the bottom, but I think that we can make a transition. And so, you know, hotels can do this because it's good for them to just know they're impacting, using their power for good. We're going to talk to New Orleans and Company next week, and they want us to do it not just because it's good, but because it actually, we're losing money. So if we don't actually incur that expense of composting, people won't come to our city, because consumers, young generations, know that this is the future. We want to protect our planet, so they're going to take their conference to Austin, Texas, and we're not going to enjoy, you know, their business in New Orleans. So in addition to, you know, using power for good, maybe that's an expense, but then you also have the benefit of the revenue of those visiting, because, hey, we know we're doing the right thing. So hopefully, do you have hope that New Orleans can turn our image around?
Totally. I think it's, you know, we've lived in this space for the last 10 or 15 years, probably longer than that, actually, that New Orleans is kind of a dirty city, right? And I think cleaning up and fixing, like literally fixing the infrastructure of Bourbon Street. So when I'm talking about cleaning up, I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the concrete, and like fixing the plumbing system or whatever that was wrong on Bourbon so it doesn't smell quite as bad. And really sort of like working on the infrastructure. You know, it's made national news that New Orleans doesn't have our recycling back. And it's a big deal that people come here and they're like, why is there so much trash in the street? And those are things, I think you see that represented in the mayor's initiative, the Clean Up NOLA initiative, which is an expensive, again, Sisyphusian task that I think her office is discovering. And you know what? If that trash wasn't there in the first place, you wouldn't have to clean it up. And so if we're actually looking at how are we as a city moving toward reusables, as a city, how are we moving toward recycling, actual recycling, not just recyclable, and really incentivizing that, we absolutely could not only really bill ourselves as an attractive destination for a younger generation that has money to spend sometimes, but we also could increase quality of life for our residents. And I have to tell you, as somebody who's lived in New Orleans now for almost a decade, this is my multi-generations back family home, so this is like coming home to me. The fact that we're talking about New Orleans reducing its waste for the sake of tourists infuriates me, Liz. It infuriates me because I'm not a tourist. I'm not going to go to a New Orleans hotel, but I don't want to have to pick trash out of the storm drain and the catch basin in front of my house every day. And I don't blame the people who end up dropping the trash. I blame the fact that we have this system that is predicated on trash to begin with. And there's no place to put that trash. And there's no recycling system. And we've normalized the fact that the earth will eat it or whatever. And I think that we need to be talking about how we are building out these things for the people who live here. And I'll close that thought by also saying that I think it's important, New Orleans is a majority Black city in the Deep South. It is also important that we listen to the elders who have lived in this city for multiple generations, who have loved it for multiple generations, and actually work in building programs with them in a decision-making participatory capacity that is actually about bringing everybody together. Because I think the trash in New Orleans is everybody's problem. Nobody loves it. It's not like anybody on my street likes the trash in the street. We're all picking it out. Regardless of gender or socioeconomic background or race, we are all picking up trash out of the street because it sucks. And I think that we absolutely need to be building these programs for trash reduction, not just for the tourists and for the people who come through the hotels, but for the people who live here. And No Waste Louisiana really prides itself on being the only zero waste organization that is part of that formation in the state of Louisiana and is really working to bring folks who are interested in waste reduction into this conversation about climate justice, which are two normally really different conversations, but are actually the same conversation. Surprise! And so we're bringing folks in. And whenever we bring people to New Orleans, we always recommend that they don't use Airbnb because that's not good for the local economy or for the local people. And we actually recommend that they stay at one of the only 2 unionized hotels in the city of New Orleans because worker dignity and worker protections are important to us. And I think that's something that hotels need to be internalizing. Also, we give folks coming into town a list of Black-owned restaurants in the area, Black-owned coffee shops like the one we're in right now, because we have to be respecting the economic system on which this city is built, but does not always give its due. And so I think that's something that we have to make sure that we are reinforcing in even the ways that we talk about waste.
Without a doubt. And so when we work on this zero waste challenge with the hospitality industry, yes, it's a good business. It's a good business decision, but it's also good for employees. It's also good for the residents who live here. And what we want to do with the Love Your City directory is actually highlight local Black-owned companies. We want to highlight the hotels and restaurants that are engaged in this effort and engaged in this conversation and really bring people together in a common campaign. So from the grassroots organizations to the large industrial organizations, that we can all work together on this issue and we can all build a stronger Louisiana. So check out those organizations on loveyourcity.us. We hope this coffee shop will join after we talk. And just thank you, Jane and Jake, for being here. This has been such a lovely conversation, and thanks to all our listeners for jumping into this conversation. We'll see what happens next week.
And if you're interested for more information on the Plastics Treaty, you can go to ciel.org. That's cl.org on the plastics page. And thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jane.